Dr. Paul Mason. Reversing type 2 diabetes is entirely possible by removing excess carbs. Here is how.
So what a lot of people don't realize is that our body can turn something made of carbohydrate and turn it into fat. And in actual fact, our body can store carbohydrates as fat much more easily than it can store fat as fat. And at the outset, that seems really strange because it seems obvious that, oh, if I'm eating the fat on the lamb chop, then that must be easily stored as body fat. It's actually not stored as body fat that easily. But if you have a donut or a bowl of cereal or some sugars or something like that, or mangoes or banana, whatever, carbohydrate, that can be turned as fat. So de novo lipogenesis is what happens when you deliver too much energy, basically often resulting from carbohydrate consumption, to the liver. So the liver is like a warehouse, a vault, and that can store a little bit of glucose as something called glycogen. It can store about 100 grams or thereabout. But then what happens when your glycogen stores are full? The liver will then turn that carbohydrate into fat, into a triglyceride fat. And then that triglyceride fat, what does it do? Well, it often ends up being stored in your abdomen or your organs or wherever, stored fat under the action of insulin. So de novo lipogenesis is the process where the body will convert carbohydrate and turn it into fat, and that fat very often is then subsequently stored in your stomach, on your hips, on your thighs, in your liver. The definition of diabetes is having too much glucose circulating around in your blood. So then the thought process goes, well, if carbohydrates are made of glucose, and most of the glucose in your blood comes from what you eat, if you simply stop eating the glucose, that is, stop eating the carbohydrates, your blood glucose levels must be then well controlled, and therefore you don't have diabetes. Now, that part is potentially true in terms of the diabetes will be under control while you're not eating the carbohydrate. But then a thought process is, well, then if you just start to eat the carbohydrates again, then your metabolism must be as sick as it used to be, and your blood sugar levels would go straight up to, terrible, terrible levels. You see, people with diabetes, they don't have the same ability to handle carbohydrates that an average person does because their insulin is not working properly. Whereas you or I, we might be able to eat 100 grams of carbohydrates and our blood sugar levels wouldn't rise too much. Somebody with diabetes, that would send it up into the stratosphere.
Insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes is usually caused by eating too many carbs over an extended time. This produces excess insulin, which becomes more and more ineffective. That is insulin resistance.
But the interesting thing is that it's possible to reverse insulin resistance. And if you can reverse insulin resistance, then you can restore a normal ability to deal with carbohydrates that people used to have in their younger years when they were more metabolically healthy. And I do a test called a Kraft test on a lot of my patients. And that's where we actually get a drink, and it's of 75 grams of glucose. You drink that, and we follow your glucose levels over 2 hours. And the Kraft test is we also measure the insulin levels over 2 hours and see if they're also going too high or too low. And what we'll generally see is that people's ability to handle glucose over that 2 hour period after they've fixed their metabolism will often be back to normal. Their blood sugar, even when they consume the carbohydrates, their glucose levels don't rise anymore. And in those patients, I think it's safe to say you reversed their diabetes.
Our body can take carbohydrates and turn them into fat. It can store carbs as fat much more easily than it can store fat as fat. Eating donuts, cereal, mangoes, bananas, and other carbohydrates all easily turn into body fat. De novo lipogenesis is when we deliver too much energy, usually in the form of carbs, to our liver. Our liver can only store a little glucose, called glycogen. When full, the liver then turns excess carbs into fat. These are triglycerides. The triglyceride fat often is stored as fat in the abdomen, in our organs, in our hips, thighs, and in our liver, under the action of insulin, which is the storage hormone. Diabetes. having too much glucose circulating in the blood. So, since carbs are made of glucose, and most of the glucose comes from what we eat, if we stop eating too many carbs, our diabetes will end. This is a potentially true statement. We can get our type 2 diabetes under control. If you begin eating excess carbs again, the diabetes will return. Diabetics don't have the same ability to handle carbs as non-diabetics because their insulin is not working properly. Insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes is usually caused by eating too many carbs over an extended time. This produces excess insulin, which becomes more and more ineffective. That is insulin resistance. It is possible to reverse insulin resistance. Doing so restores the ability to handle carbs well. In the Kraft test, the patient drinks 75 grams of glucose. After 2 hours, the doctor measures the glucose level and the insulin level. Most people who have fixed their metabolism, in other words, they've reversed their insulin resistance, handle glucose as well as metabolically healthy people. Those who have reversed insulin resistance, when they consume carbs, their blood glucose levels don't rise. At this point, we can say, you've reversed your diabetes.